All right, we are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us. Unfortunately, last week we had to cut it short because of some technical some technical difficulties. But this week we're going to catch up to where we were hoping to get to last week. Thank you all for joining us. I'm glad to they're all back here and joining us again today. A number of the regulars, so to speak, are out of town. Or in different time zones, so they won't be joining us today. However, I'm glad everyone who is here made it, and we're gonna get started now. So before anything else, I'm gonna jump into the share screen so you can all see what we're looking at. Just a reminder, what we do in this class is I provide here the Hebrew text. I already raised the font size. I hope it's, oh no, I didn't. Look at that. Now it's bigger. We don't provide the English text because what we're trying to do is translate it a little differently than you'll usually find in the translators, more accurate to the actual literal meaning of the words, and hopefully pick out some important lessons from that process. So without any further ado, we are standing right now at verse number 15, okay? And that is this over here. Now, again, because we did not have a chance to actually have the proper class last week, it's been now basically 2 weeks since the last time we learned. So to recap where we were, at the beginning of the book, King Solomon, first he gives us his basic introduction, where he explains his credentials as a wise man, why he's wise and why he's worth listening to, particularly because not just who he was, and we understand that he had a gift of higher insight, but also because he was surrounded by wise people. He had the financial means to gather wise people around him, and he had access to all different forms of wisdom, and that's one of the reasons why we can trust him as a wise person. Now, 2 weeks ago, when we started with verse number 12, I said originally that this seems to be a second intro to the end of the first chapter. I wanted to revise that a little bit, not necessarily that it's a second intro to the book as a whole, but really it's a second intro to the first half of the book. Meaning to say, if you look, I'm just going to jump a little earlier in the text over here to verse number 11. And we mentioned in verse number 11 that there was this little marker over here. In the Hebrew text, it's a little letter, it's the Hebrew letter Pei. I just highlighted it over here, and it's in brackets. And what that means is that if you had a version of the Sefer of the book of Kohelet written out as it would be as a scribe writes it on parchment with the proper ink and everything like that, there would be a little break there, and that starts the next section. What's fascinating about the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet, is that there's only 2 of those in the entire book. So one way to understand that is King Solomon first lets us know the first 11 verses of the book are telling us that he is qualified, and he's giving us his general intro for the entire book. But then he goes along and has half the book where he's discussing one idea, and then in the second half of the book he's going to discuss a second idea. And that's really the entire, all 13 chapters of the book of Kohelet can be basically divided into two major subjects, and in those there's going to be a lot of branches, but the basic idea is that there's going to be 2 main ideas he's going to discuss. Number 1, which is what we're getting started with right now, is this world, how to deal with emotions and money and friendships and all those sorts of things that we have going on in this world, this worldly things. The second half of the book, I have to look at, we'll get into it a little bit more when we get there. But at first glance, it seems to be where he's going to be talking about attributes, how people act, and the proper way to act beyond this world. How exactly what that means and how it's going to play out, we'll see more as we get there. Again, that's not going to be for another 7 or 8 chapters before we get there. So what I'm offering now is that starting at verse 12, he's giving an intro from verse 12 to the end of the chapter 1. He's giving kind of an intro of now that we're going to be discussing what we call in Hebrew Olam Haza, this world and all the struggles of this world. He's going to now give an introduction to that major subject. And so we started that 2 weeks ago, where he reiterates his qualifications. And then the last thing that we introduced was this contrast between what he calls his heart and what he refers to as his eyes. And the idea that we came across over here was that the heart is proper academic inspection of something, to look at something objectively, and to really inspect it with wisdom, as opposed to when you look at something with the eyes are subjective. It's how you perceive things. It's at first glance. It's kind of on the surface, and I can't get any deeper. And so he's going to be kind of jumping back and forth between the eyes and the heart, and giving us two different takes about this world. So looking back at verse 14, which was, again, a verse we did in the past, he says, I've looked with my eyes. I've looked at everything that there is under the sun. And at first glance, my claim is everything is Hevel. That's our word that we keep on using, that, again, is often translated as futility, but we are translating it as steam. It's something that's there. It's hard to grasp. There's what to do with it. It's not nothing. It's actually something. Okay, so he refers to everything in this world as steam, and it's spirit breaking, re'us ruach, which we're going to see that word come up again in this week's verses. So again, that's his initial understanding. Just looking with his eyes at the world without really inspecting it, that's what he sees. He looks at the world, first glance, he says, okay, everything is two things. Number one, it's Hevel, and number two, it's Ru'us Ruach. So it's steam and it's spirit breaking. And in that's where we start now with our verse 15. And he says, Me'uvas lo yuchal liskon, that something that is bent is unable to be fixed. V'chesron lo yuchal lihimanos, and something that is missing is unable to be brought up to count. That's a strange word, and I don't know a perfect English translation for it, but it can be not be brought up to a point of being counted. But whether that means it's unable to be fulfilled, accomplished, we'll have to, those are kind of ideas that are brought out in that word. So again, I'm going to read the verse again, piece by piece. Me'uvas, something that is bent, lo yuchal liskon, is unable to be fixed. V'chesron, and something that is missing, lo yuchal lihimanos, is unable to be filled. Okay, to put it simply. This verse, there's two ways we could come to understand what this verse is talking about. Either, and this seems to be based on how we're understanding the flow of the book so far, I think this is the best understanding, is that he's saying, looking at the world, again, looking with our eyes, not looking subjectively at the world and not objectively, looking at the world subjectively, what we're going to say is it's broken. It can't be fixed. It's missing things. It will never reach fulfillment. That's the surface vision of the world, right? People are broken. The world is broken. There's no perfect system. There's nothing. There's no hope. Is what the idea would be if someone were to see this world without thinking deeply about it. Seeing it on the surface, that could be your takeaway. That everything is broken, cannot be fixed. It's missing. There's just something that we're never going to be able to attain in this world. That's one take of it. But as we're going to see, he's going to move beyond that when he goes back to talking from the heart as opposed to from the eyes. That's one way of understanding the verse. The second way is that when we see something as broken, when we see something as it's bent, we are not going to be able to fix it. And it's kind of a lesson in that sense. Something that we perceive as being broken, that's when we are unable to fix it. This is kind of more of a expounding on the verse, but something that, again, we're talking about seeing with our eyes. If we see something as broken, then we will never be able to fix it. Meaning to say that if in order to have a mindset of building and fixing and growing in this world, we have to get past looking at things as broken or missing. We have to look beyond that and see things as fixable. And as long as we still categorize things as mu'uvas, as something that's bent, that means innately it's bent. In and of itself, it's bent. And sorry, not innately, inherently it's bent. And you can't fix that. Or something is missing, this world is missing, and there's nothing you could do about it. So yeah, you're never going to be able to fix it. That's kind of a more expounding, what we would call drush in the verse over here. That it's coming to tell us a little bit of a lesson for our own lives. What's interesting is the commentaries bring out a couple different points over here. First of all, in regard to this word halfway through the verse over here, v'chesron. Let me highlight that by itself. Keeps on doing that. Sorry. V'chesron. The word v'chesron means that something is missing from this world. And one of the great commentators over here, Rabbi Akiva O'Connor, not exactly sure which century, but he was in the early, so probably 14th or 15th century commentator on the books of the Tanakh. He mentions over here that a fascinating thing about this world is everything does kind of start off with a level of being missing. So we actually mentioned a couple weeks ago that the Talmud tells us that eventually, when the world is in its completion, plants will grow and full loaves of bread, as opposed to wheat. But as we have it right now, the world, when you plant wheat, you get wheat. And that wheat has to go through a number of processes before you can actually eat it. So you have to harvest it. First of all, you have to plant it. You have to plow the field, water it. You have to let it grow. You have to harvest it. You have to pick through and make sure you get rid of all the straw. You have to grind it into flour. You have to take the flour, turn it into dough, and all the steps you have to go through before you're able to actually eat bread. Same thing with our clothing. All the steps you have to go through from if you're just using wool or linen or natural fibers, just all the processes you have to go through before you can get to those things. All the more so, and nowadays we've got polyester and all the plastics that we use, that a lot of our clothing is made out of. The amount of things that you have to go through in order to get that product to then wear clothing, it's an amazing thing. In fact, one of the rabbis in the Talmud tells us that he is luckier than Adam, the first human being, because Adam, even in the Garden of Eden, had to do all these things in order to get everything he needed. He was the only person around, him and his wife and their kids. So they had to figure out everything all by themselves. So this world does have a certain degree of lack, but it's up to us to go and fill it. Again, that depends on your mindset. If your mindset is it's impossible to fill the lack, then we're not going to be able to. But if you do have a mindset of things can be filled, then you'll be able to move past that. One more point before we move on to the next verses, that the rabbis in the Talmud actually bring this verse up quite often. It's a very common verse that the rabbis bring up, and they bring it up particularly in regards to things that they have perceived, that they see as sins and situations that cannot be rectified, which unfortunately, even though we do believe in repentance and I mean, that's one of the major differences between us and other religions, is that we believe that every sin can be repented for, but there is such a thing as missing an opportunity. So the key example of that is there's a mitzvah, there's a commandment from the Torah in order that every person should recite the Shema twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And there's a very specific time slot that a person's supposed to do that in the first three hours of daylight, starting from a little while before sunrise to 3 hours into the day. And same thing at night. It's from the time the sun sets till the time the sun rises. And unfortunately, if a person misses that opportunity, if they don't take that opportunity and recite the Shema at that time, so of course they can repent for that, but it doesn't change the fact that they missed an opportunity to recite the Shema. The same thing is we have a commandment to go and enjoy meals on the Chag. On whenever we have a Yom Tov, a holiday, we have a mitzvah to go and enjoy those meals. And if you miss that opportunity, so you can make it up in certain ways. And again, you can always repent for missing a mitzvah, but you did lose out something. The rabbis also apply this to another situation of if somebody, unfortunately, somebody who was a Torah scholar and then takes all their wisdom and throws it out and leaves the Torah study behind. That also is somebody who is considered a mu'uvas, somebody who's bent, lo yuchal liskon, who is unable to be fixed. Now that's a little different case because of course a person that's a clear case where repentance is a possibility, but the idea is the same, that you have something where it's seemingly unrectifiable. Okay. So those are a couple cases where the rabbis use this verse. Again, that's not the literal meaning of the verse, but it's a kind of a homiletic expounding on the verse. Okay, go back to our system of understanding the verses over here. We've got, again, he's talking so far about when he's using his eyes and he's subjectively and not thoroughly looking at the world. His first reaction is it's worthless, it's spirit breaking, it's unfixable, and there's nothing you could do about it. The world is, to hell in a handbasket. That's his eyes talking. Now we're going to move on in verse number 16 over here. We're going to move on to, now he's going to bring it back to his heart. Okay. And this is a longer verse, so we're going to go through it piece by piece. He says, Dibarti ani im libi. I've spoken with my heart. Again, after seeing things, I've spoken with my heart. Lamor. And I said to it, hold on a second. Ani, me, hine higdalti v'hosafti chachma. I have gathered all and brought together all this wisdom. Al kol asher haya lefanai al Yerushalayim. Remember, that was his qualification. I have gathered all this wisdom to one place, to Jerusalem. V'libi ra'ah harbe chachma v'das. And my heart is able to see much more wisdom and knowledge than my eyes ever could. Okay? So he's reprimanding himself in a way. Whereas in the past verses, he's been not talking with wisdom necessarily. He's been talking with just how he perceives things emotionally. He's now reprimanding himself and saying, wait a second, King Solomon, you're the one who gathered all the wisdom. Let's look at it again with the right perspective. So to read that again, it's a long verse, so we'll break it up. Dibarti ani im libi lemor. I have spoken with my heart, saying, Ani hine higdalti v'hosafti chachma. I have made great and gathered wisdom. Al kol asher haya lefanai al Yerushalayim. Everything before me has been brought to Jerusalem. Again, the city of scholars. V'libi ra'ah harbe chachma v'das. And my heart has seen much wisdom and knowledge. Okay, I'm going to read it all together as one, so that we could see it all together as how it flows. Dibarti ani libi lemor. I have spoken with my heart, saying, Ani hine higdalti v'hosafti chachma. I have made great and gathered wisdom, al kol asher haya lefanai al Yerushalayim, of all that is before me to Jerusalem. V'libi ra'ah harbe chachma v'das, and my heart has seen much wisdom and knowledge. Okay. So again, the idea here is that he's reminding himself that he can't stop at seeing things on their surface. If we just see things as they are on the surface, and we don't take the time to inspect them and look into them properly, we're going to miss a lot of things. We're going to end up with this very negative perspective on the world. And again, that's our thesis for the book of Kohelet, is not that it's the depressing book that everyone thinks it is, but it's actually an empowering book. It's actually giving us hope for the future. And so that's really what he's telling himself over here is, King Solomon, you yourself should know that your wisdom requires you to look beyond what you see with your eyes. It requires you to go the next step and bring it again back to the heart. And the heart is where we're considering the seat of intellect. And so he has to bring his intellect back. A fascinating idea here is that you can be the wisest of all people in the entire world, entire history of the world, the wisest person ever, wiser than Moses, but still you have to remind yourself to think. I think that's a fascinating idea, because we can so easily, even a smart person can so easily fall into a rote in the way that they think. They get stuck in certain patterns of thinking and can't seem to get out of it. I on a totally side note, and I recently had a birthday, and I thought to myself, okay, so I'll tell you, I'm now 30 years old. Okay, so sometimes the way my brain works is it says, okay, 30 years, I've been listening to wisdom. I've been around Torah scholars for many of those years. I've met a lot of different people, different walks of life. I've read a lot of books. I probably heard everything that there is to hear. And obviously that's not true, and I continue to learn things every day and see new things and get new experiences, and the world itself changes all the time. Even if you are well trained, even if you are well read, even if you're a deep thinker, you have to sometimes remind yourself to think deeply. So even King Solomon, again, the wisest of all people, is able to not see things for what they really are, and to just kind of see things on the surface. And he has to remind himself, hey, I'm the guy who brought all the wisdom to Jerusalem. I'm the guy who has I am the guy who has all the qualifications for wisdom. I have to use that and not just rest on my laurels, and to keep thinking. It's an important part of living. Okay. Second. Are there any questions before we move on to the next two verses? I'll give a couple seconds for anyone to chime in if you have any questions. Okay. All right. So we are going to move on to verse 17, which again, he's now speaking from his heart, meaning from that proper way of thinking. And he says, Va'etana libi, I have given my heart, Ladat chachma vadat, to know wisdom and knowledge. Okay, sorry, I put the comma in the wrong place. Ladat chachma, to know wisdom. Vidat holelot v'sichlut. And there's an interesting word over here, an interesting phrase over here. To know foolishness and frivolity. Okay, I have given my heart to know two things: to know wisdom and to know foolishness. Yadati, and now I know, shagam zeh hu rayon ruach, that this is spirit breaking. Okay, so we're going to break this. We're going to read this again. Again, it's a complicated verse. I even put the comma in the wrong place at first. So let's read it again together. V'atana libi, I have given over my heart, ladat chachma, to know wisdom, number one, v'dat holelot v'sichlut, and also to know foolishness and frivolity. I'm sorry. Yadati, and now I know, shagam zeh hu rayon ruach, that this actually is spirit breaking. Okay. Interesting words over here that he uses. First of all, and we've already seen this, but we haven't touched on this, is he keeps on flipping back and forth between knowledge and wisdom. And they are similar and related ideas, but they are different, especially in Torah text and study. We very often will separate the two of them. Chochma, wisdom, which we usually translate in English as wisdom. Chachma is just raw knowledge, right? To know things, right? As opposed to da'at, which is, again, that's actually what we would call knowledge. So let me step back a second. Chachma being wisdom, da'at being knowledge, or more clearly understanding. So the oft quoted joke, but it's really true, is that wisdom is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, is botanically regarded as a fruit, and knowledge is knowing, or understanding is knowing, that it doesn't belong in a fruit salad, right? So that's the that's the joke that they say, and that's really what he's doing over here. Is he's saying that there are two factors that he has. So number one is da'at, is knowledge, and chachma is wisdom. So that's actually, King Solomon has a leg up on both of us in those regards. Has a leg up on us on both those regards, because he's got wisdom. He just had the raw knowledge, and he also had a greater level of understanding than your average person. But then he also brings in this idea of knowledge or understanding. Again, I'm gonna stop using the word knowledge. He brings up this idea of understanding foolishness and frivolity. Holelut is actually the same word as Hallel. So on holidays, we sing Hallel in Shul, in the synagogue. We go and we praise Hashem with Hallel, which is, Hallel means to praise, but it's a very specific type of praise. It's a praise where you kind of get so emotionally involved in it that you lose some of your physical capacities. You go a little crazy with praise. That's the idea of Hallel, and that's the idea of Holelot is also craziness or silliness, really, more than anything. All right, and then Sichlut is actually interesting, because Sechel, also spelled the same way, is intellect, but Sichlut means frivolity, or that's Holy. I'm sorry. Sichlut means foolishness. So it's whenever you're going through the words of Tanakh, you'll find that very often the Hebrew letter sin, and over here the Hebrew letter samach, they're often interchanged. Words that we would use in modern Hebrew with a samach, often in Hebrew will get written with a sin. They have the same sound for most Jews. I think the Yemenite Jews may pronounce the sounds a little differently, but for most Jews, the custom is to pronounce them the exact same way, or the S sound as we would have it in English. So because of that, the letters can be interchanged. You find this many times in the Torah, and throughout the rest of the books of Tanakh. So here it's really sichlut with the letter samach, but it's interesting that he writes it here with the letter sin, which can be interchanged with intellect. So we have the same word being used for intellect and for foolishness. It's a fascinating thing, and I'm sure there's a lot to pull out of that. I don't have a great understanding of why the two words are so linguistically related. I mean, you could say all sorts of different ideas on it, but the general idea is that you know what? Let's put that aside. Over here, the general idea is that King Solomon is saying, not only do I have to understand wisdom, but I also need to understand foolishness. And I think that's going back to what he wants us to know, that he's. We mentioned this also a couple weeks ago. He's trying to make sure that we realize that he's not biased in his approach to this world. he's trying to remove the natural subjective bias that a person has when approaching wisdom. So what does he do? He not only works and tries to understand knowledge and wisdom and understanding, things that are generally accepted as wisdom, but he, being a wise person, says, I want to know what people think is foolish also. What do people consider frivolous? What do people consider worthless? Because sometimes those things actually there's wisdom hidden inside of it also. If you were to tell someone 400, 500, 600 years ago, let's go before the Renaissance, if you were to tell somebody in 600 years ago that, maybe government would work a lot better without a king. Maybe the people should decide what's the right way to run a society. They look at you like you were crazy. And now we know, we're nearly 250 years into this experiment, and it's a great form of government. Obviously, it's got its faults and its quirks, and but it works. It has worked really well thus far. And so in the same way, something that people may perceive as foolish, it's up to us to go and say, inspect it. Is it really foolish? Is there something to gain out of it? Is it, we're so quick to throw away things that don't match our sensitivities. And in reality, maybe it's worthwhile to take a second and say, what is the thought process over there? Is there something I can gain? Even if I don't agree with it, is there something I could gain from it? So King Solomon says, I'm going to look at this world, and I'm not just going to look at the wisdom. I'm also going to look at those things that people perceive as being foolish, and that will give me a rounder picture of this world. So he says, I'm going to do that. I am going to go and put my heart to it, to know wisdom and to know foolishness. I'm going to look at everything around me. And he says, I'm doing that, Yadati, and now I know, Shagam Zehu Rayon Ruach, that this also is spirit breaking. Okay? He agrees with what he said with his eyes on one point. He says the world is spirit breaking. You will notice, though, that he misses another phrase over here. Back here in verse 14, he said that when he looked at everything under the sun, when he looked with his eyes, not with his heart, when he looked with his eyes on the outside, he said everything is two things. It's number one, it's hevel, and it's ru'us ruach. It is both steam and spirit breaking. But when he looks just with his heart and he takes out that bias and he takes out that and when he turns to the objective, he agrees it's spirit breaking, but he takes out the hevel. He removes the that steam aspect that we mentioned before. I would say, now one of the things we mentioned about steam was that it's you can gather it, like a distiller is able to gather steam. It's very difficult. I think one of the things he's trying to say here is it might not be as hard as you think, right? When you look at it just on the outside, and you look at the world and try to grasp and get wisdom and get what you're trying to get out of this world, you may look at it at first and say, this is impossible. It's like trying to catch steam in your hands. But after you look at it properly, as he's going to do throughout the rest of the book, again, this is still in a idea of introduction. So when we go and we look at the rest of the world with a proper mindset, we're going to see that it's not impossible. It's hard. It's, as he says, rayon ruach. It's spirit breaking. It can be potentially spirit breaking. It's not impossible. And he's going to give us, before he ends the intro, he's going to give us one reason why sometimes we find it so difficult. And that will be in the next verse. Actually, I'm just going to jump into that right now. This is our last verse in chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 1, verse 18. And he says, Ki, because, Rov chachma, with lots of wisdom, Rav ka'as. You can end up with a lot of anger also. V'yosef das, and by gathering lots of understanding, Yosef machov, you can actually lead yourself to a lot of worry. Okay? Now this does not seem to be a very hope-filled verse, but it's actually a warning for those who are involved in the study of wisdom. And he says, wisdom is very important, and it's going to get you very far, and we're going to see that a lot throughout the book. And wisdom that's our key. But he gives one word of warning before we start, and this is probably why it's spirit breaking. if you spend a lot of time thinking about things, you can potentially lead yourself down darker paths, right? Lots of wisdom can lead you to lots of anger, right? If you know everything going on in the world, it can make a person very angry, right? We've seen that now since the advent of immediate information. As soon as something happens in the world, we all know about it, and we're all reactionary to it. So that's anger. We find immediately we jump to anger so quickly because we have so much wisdom. We've got so much raw knowledge coming at us. The tendency is to react to it angrily. And when it comes to understanding, the more a person understands something, that could also gather in or add to their worry. Again, being the wisest of all people, he's going to guide us to make sure we don't fall into that trap. But it's something to keep in mind. A fascinating thing that I actually just saw recently from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was a German rabbi from the 19th century. He writes in his commentary on one of the Torah portion a couple weeks ago. He says that very often you can have people who are mental elites, right? They're very smart, wise people, but because their brains are constantly doing mental gymnastics, they forget what's really in front of them, right? They can be so twisted in their thinking that they get to a point where they forget the reality. And you can see this all the time. There's a line I remember hearing that certain things are so backwards that only an intellectual can believe them, right? Obviously, that's a little disparaging to intellectuals, but the idea is the same, that you can have an idea it takes so many steps and twists and turns to get there that it may just be against reality. It may just be fighting in the face of reality. So actually, he was bringing up, Rabbi Hirsch was bringing it up in regards to when Joseph brings the idea to Pharaoh to go ahead and choose someone to gather the food for those 7 years of plenty before the famine settles in. He said, find a person who is both wise and understanding, because that person will be able to not just take the information and the situation they're given with, but they'll also be able to use understanding to guide that, but also not the other way. You don't want them to just have understanding, but not enough. You want to have both factors playing against each other and keeping each other in check, and making sure that your brain doesn't spin into, again, what I call mental gymnastics. So that's another idea over here. Another thing that seems to come out of the verse over here is he talks about rov chachma, much, or we would actually translate it in Hebrew often as a majority of wisdom. So from having much wisdom, you can increase your anger. But when you actually get to a point of all wisdom, that's when you're in the godly stage, so to speak. That's another tamper for that, anger. If you're just looking at the world without the guidance of God and the Torah scholars and everything like that, you're going to end up, that's when you could run into anger. Same thing with increasing knowledge, you can increase worry. But if you get to the point where you reach the pinnacle, you reach the top and you fill it up with knowledge and understanding, then you may potentially, that would not be anger provoking. It wouldn't stir the person's anger. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to see if there was anything else specifically I wanted to cover. Okay. Yeah, so that is the intro to the first, I'd say the first book of Kohelet. Again, that's going to take us for quite a few chapters now. The first thing he's going to discuss is the idea of happiness, which is, it's such a broad topic, and it's going to be such an interesting topic, because in Jewish philosophy, it's been a subject of debate amongst modern day and recent generation scholars too, is how to approach the idea of happiness. And I'm just going to give you my take based on how we're reading King Solomon. But there's so much to talk about. We in just within the past 300 years, since, like, for example, since the Hasidic movement has started in the late 1700s till now, famously the Hasidic movement was very into happiness, and happiness in the name of serving God, and at the same time we had people who were very anti that, and you had other people who just never really thought too much about it. And there's all these sorts of things. So we're going to see how King Solomon approaches the idea of happiness, and how we're going to look at it from there. That's going to be his first. I think that's the best way to put it. The first book of Kohelet, he's going to be talking about this world, and the first chapter of that is going to be happiness. He's going to discuss happiness from money, and happiness from living your best life, or spending everything you got, and different ways that he tried to achieve happiness and what he came out with in the end. And again, we'll see as we go through what that is. In regards to his intro here, he wanted us to know, number one, he's got the qualifications because he's not speaking just on his own. He's got all these wise people surrounding him. He's also contrasting ideas. He's got wisdom and what people consider as foolishness. He's looking at both of them. He's not throwing away one or the other. He's making sure to not just stop at what his eyes see, but looking past that and trying to see what his heart sees. Again, meaning not to just see things on the surface, but to really inspect their insides and get an idea of what's going on in the mechanics of things. So these are all ideas that he's bringing up to eliminate bias, to prove that there's proper wisdom over here. He mentioned in his original intro, we also mentioned that he brought up the idea that these truths are going to be timeless. They're always going to apply. So don't think like King Solomon didn't foresee electricity, or he never read Thomas Paine. He's preempting you, and he's saying, I have considered everything. He's the wisest of all people, as witnessed by God. So he has considered all sides, and this is going to be these are going to be timeless lessons as he moves forward. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us, and we will continue with chapter 2 next week. All right, I'll see you then.